The moment was supposed to be one of pure celebration, a cap-and-gown kind of day, where every flash of a camera and every cheer from the crowd marked years of effort and achievement. My name, Zoe Richardson, had just echoed across the gymnasium speakers, signaling it was time to stride across the stage, accept my diploma, and capture that signature smile for the rows of parents and phones waiting eagerly. But instead of stepping forward, I stood frozen halfway across the polished gymnasium floor as a voice cut through the air like a scalpel. "You're not my real daughter anyway," my father, well, the man I had called my father, declared with chilling finality. The room, packed with nearly 400 people, reacted in stunned unison. Gasps erupted, heads turned, conversations died mid-sentence. The hum of anticipation that had filled the auditorium just moments ago evaporated. Even the baby in the third row, who'd been fussing throughout the ceremony, suddenly fell silent as if the weight of the words had stunned him too. A dozen phones stopped mid-recording, a dozen more started recording again. Every lens was now turned toward me and the man seated in the fourth row, Ethan, arms folded like a corporate boss delivering a cold termination. That's what this was to him. A public execution of support, a cutting of ties in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. I should have crumbled. I should have burst into tears and run off the stage, broken and humiliated. That's certainly what Ethan had expected. That's what the audience probably assumed was coming. But I didn't do that, not even close. Instead, I smiled. Not a sad, forced smile, a real one, the kind that made the corners of my eyes crinkle. The kind Caitlin, my mom, used to say made my whole face light up. Because Ethan had just handed me the perfect opportunity. "Well," I said loud enough that the microphone perched nearby picked up every syllable, "since we're sharing family DNA secrets." From my graduation folder I pulled out a simple white envelope, clean, unassuming, the kind of envelope you'd expect to hold a greeting card or maybe a letter of congratulations. But this envelope contained neither. Inside was something much heavier, something far more explosive than Ethan's little announcement. Something I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Michelle, Ethan's wife, who had been glowing with pride just moments ago, went pale, her expression drained of all color as she realized what envelope I had just revealed. The baby in her lap, his baby supposedly, squirmed and started to fuss again, perhaps sensing the rising tension. The principal at the edge of the stage waved me toward the diploma table, trying to usher me away from the mic, clearly wanting to steer the ceremony back on course. But I wasn't moving. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Instead of heading to the table like the other graduates, I made my way to the podium. "If Ethan wants to have a conversation about DNA," I said, adjusting the microphone stand to my height, "then let's talk about genetics, because they're interesting, and sometimes they reveal truths people would rather keep buried." The gymnasium was still. The air conditioner above me hummed faintly, the only sound breaking the silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on me. Michelle had started shaking her head, lips forming the words no over and over, barely able to breathe. But I didn't flinch. "You're absolutely right, Ethan," I continued, locking eyes with him. "I'm not your biological daughter. I've known that for years. Caitlin told me when I was 12. She made sure I understood that I was still loved, still chosen, still family." I saw Ethan falter, his rigid posture slackened. This wasn't going the way he expected, not even close. "But here's the thing about DNA secrets," I said, holding up the envelope, pausing just long enough to make sure every camera was still rolling. "Sometimes the ones shouting the loudest have the most to hide." I opened the envelope slowly, dramatically. The sound of the paper crackling echoed through the room like a thunderclap in the silence. "The child you've been showing off these past 6 months, that precious baby boy," I began, my voice unwavering, "isn't your child." Gasps broke out instantly, audible, sharp, and collective. Phones tilted upward, parents stood, friends craned their necks. Even the graduates on stage were frozen in place, diplomas forgotten in their hands. "Michelle," I said without turning, "has been having an affair with your brother Jason, for more than a year now." The room erupted into stunned whispers. I heard one girl behind me whisper, "Oh my God," like it was a prayer. "The baby she's holding?" I pressed on, calm and composed, even though my heart was beating like a drum. "He's not your son, he's your nephew." Ethan's legs buckled beneath him. He dropped into a seat like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His face twisted in confusion, denial, and then devastation. Michelle, meanwhile, let out a strangled noise and bolted for the exit, baby in arms. She stumbled down the aisle, tripping over heels and bumping into guests as she made her way toward the heavy double doors. The entire crowd followed her movement, recording, whispering, shocked. "I have the DNA test results right here," I continued, lifting a few papers from the envelope. 99.9% match. That baby is genetically Jason's child, not Ethan's. The gymnasium was chaos now. People shouting, moving, pointing, filming. My classmates on stage weren't moving. It was like time had frozen for everyone but me. Oh, and Michelle, I added, raising my voice as she reached the doors. You might want to keep better track of your hotel receipts, and those jewelry purchases, and the lunches with Jason you thought were so discreet. The paper trail doesn't lie. She stumbled once more, nearly dropping the baby, then vanished through the doors with a crash. I turned back to Ethan. He was staring at me like I was a stranger, like he'd never really seen me before today. You wanted to cut me off, I said, my voice slicing through the disarray. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone I know. You succeeded, but not in the way you thought. You wanted to make sure everyone knew I wasn't truly one of you, I said, stepping to the edge of the stage and staring directly at Ethan, whose face had gone from triumphant to devastated in a matter of minutes. Well, congratulations. I let the silence hang there for a heartbeat, just long enough for everyone to soak in the gravity of the moment. You've just given me the perfect platform to return the favor. The crowd was practically vibrating now. Phones were out in every direction, some capturing video, others already live streaming. I could hear the rapid shudder of cameras snapping photos, and the low hum of voices whispering furiously. This was already on its way to becoming a local legend. By the time the sun set, it would be viral, spreading like wildfire through town gossip channels and social media threads. Ethan Richardson, a local business tycoon, self-proclaimed family man, and respected face of community leadership, had been utterly dismantled by his own hypocrisy. And the best part? I hadn't had to lie. I hadn't exaggerated. Every single word I'd spoken was backed by cold, hard evidence. I slipped the DNA documents back into my folder with measured calm and made my way to the diploma table. The principal, who looked as though he'd just aged 10 years in the span of 5 minutes, handed me my diploma with trembling hands. Congratulations, Miss Richardson, he whispered, avoiding eye contact. Thank you, I replied, stepping into the designated spot for the official photo, my smile radiant and unshaken. It's definitely a day I won't forget. Camera flash. Click. Still clutching my diploma, I walked off the stage. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's voice breaking through the noise. Cracked, strained, pleading. Zoe, wait, please, we need to talk. But I didn't look back. I didn't stop walking. I had spent my entire life chasing his validation. 18 years of striving to be good enough, to be noticed, to be loved. I had wasted too many nights wondering what was wrong with me, why his affection always felt like something I had to earn, why approval from him came wrapped in conditions and cold stares. And still, part of me had wanted him to see me, really see me. But that part had died the day I discovered the truth. I had prepared for this moment for months. Every step, every word, every receipt and report gathered carefully and catalogued. I had planned this confrontation down to the second, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I knew, one day, he would try to erase me, cut me out, dismiss me like I'd never been his responsibility. I just hadn't expected him to make it this easy. The trap he'd laid for me, this public declaration, the attempt to humiliate me and exile me from the family, had collapsed spectacularly. Instead of turning me into a pariah, he'd handed me the biggest microphone in town. And I'd used it. Used it to speak the truth, to speak the one thing no one could refute. I pushed open the heavy gymnasium doors, stepping out into the late afternoon sun. Behind me, chaos still reigned. I could hear voices raised in disbelief, the principal trying in vain to regain control of the ceremony, phones buzzing with calls and messages. None of it mattered anymore. I was done. Done with the lies, done with the manipulation, done pretending to be grateful for crumbs of affection. I had my diploma in hand. I had a full scholarship to Columbia. And, most importantly, I had the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the sharpest blade is the simple, unvarnished truth. The parking lot was nearly deserted. Most people were still inside, riveted by the drama unfolding. I walked up to my old Honda Civic, cheap chipped, interior a little frayed, and tossed my graduation cap onto the passenger seat. The engine sputtered to life, a familiar sound that brought a strange kind of comfort. In the rearview mirror, I saw people beginning to trickle out of the building, some still talking into phones, others staring down at their screens, no doubt watching replays, reading comments, catching up on the firestorm I'd ignited. And I smiled. Let them talk. Let them dissect every detail. Because for the first time in my life I was truly, undeniably free. The drive home from the high school took only 15 minutes, but in that short time my thoughts spanned nearly 2 decades. I pulled into the small apartment complex where I'd been renting a one-bedroom since turning 18. As I parked, memories surged forward uninvited but sharp, like floodwaters breaking through a dam. I was 2 years old when I came to live with Ethan and Caitlin. Too young to remember the adoption, but old enough to feel, even then, that something was off, that I was in a place that wasn't entirely mine. Caitlin had tried to make up for that. She showed me the old photo albums once. There I was, barely more than a toddler, cheeks round, eyes shy, clinging to her leg like it was the only solid thing in the world. And there was Ethan in the background, stiff, distant, posed like he was attending a company retreat rather than joining a family photo. Caitlin, though, she was everything a mother should be. She hummed while folding laundry, sang terribly in the shower, read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. She could turn the most mundane afternoons into magic. Grocery store trips became scavenger hunts. Rainy days were for couch forts and hot cocoa. The house always smelled of vanilla candles and fresh flowers because, as she put it, homes should feel like a warm embrace. Ethan was different. Not cruel, not outwardly, but cold, detached, like he was watching our family from behind a pane of glass. At school events, other fathers clapped their kids on the shoulder, ruffled their hair, took silly selfies. Ethan shook hands with the teachers and checked his watch. When people asked about me, he'd say, "This is Zoe," with the same clipped tone he used for business partners. The older I got, the more obvious it became. He never called me his daughter. Our dinners felt like board meetings, where I was expected to present updates on grades, sports, and extracurriculars. Our vacations, rare as they were, always ended early when urgent business arose. But Caitlin won, and then she got sick. I was 14 when it started. Subtle signs at first, extra naps, winces when she thought no one was watching, but the illness moved quickly, and by the time the doctors figured it out, it was already too late. I will never forget the night she died. I was sitting by her hospital bed, our fingers entwined. She squeezed my hand once, faint but steady, and whispered with her last breath, "Remember, sweetheart, you were wanted, you were chosen. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." She passed with a smile on her face. Ethan wept at the funeral, real soul-shaking sobs. I tried to hold his hand, to grieve with him. He pulled away. It took me months to understand that he wasn't just mourning Caitlin. He was mourning the buffer, the one person who had held our awkward, fragmented family together. After Caitlin passed away, it was as if a switch had been flipped inside our home. The once warm and cozy space transformed into something unfamiliar. We weren't a family anymore. We were just two people coexisting in the same house, separated by an emotional chasm so wide it could have swallowed us whole. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, a constant reminder of the person we had lost. Every evening we ate dinner without exchanging more than a few meaningless words. Caitlin's chair remained at the table, empty, like a monument to everything that used to be. I tried, at first, to keep the spark of connection alive. I'd talk about school, my friends, things I hoped might draw Ethan into a conversation. He would nod occasionally, murmur vague affirmations, but his eyes always drifted away, toward his phone, or nowhere at all. I could feel his absence even when he was sitting across from me. 6 months after the funeral, he brought Michelle into our lives. She appeared at the front door wearing heels and a designer bag, her makeup immaculate, her perfume announcing her presence before she even spoke. Michelle was the opposite of Caitlin in every way. Where my mother had been warm and quietly graceful, Michelle was loud, polished, and painfully artificial. She laughed just a little too hard at jokes that weren't funny. Her smile felt like something she practiced in a mirror. "Oh, you must be the daughter," she'd said when we first met, as if she'd stumbled upon an interesting relic rather than meeting a grieving teenager. "Ethan's told me so much about you." He hadn't, of course. That much was obvious when she fumbled for 8 months later, they were married. It was a small ceremony, just family and a few of Ethan's business contacts. I wore the black dress Caitlin had once bought for formal events. Michelle spent most of the evening making snide comments about my goth phase to anyone who would listen, clearly uncomfortable with my refusal to perform happiness on demand. The house changed quickly after that. Caitlin's familiar vanilla-scented candles were replaced by sleek diffusers that made every room smell like the fragrance section of a department store. Her cozy reading corners were cleared away and redecorated with Michelle's glass figurine collections. Even the family photos were rearranged. Pictures of Caitlin and me were quietly moved to side tables or tucked into hallways, replaced by professionally staged portraits of Ethan and Michelle, her posed like a model, him smiling like someone who had finally gotten the life he wanted. Then came the news that fractured what was left of my fragile place in their world. I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table, still in my pajamas, slowly eating a bowl of cereal, when Michelle gently placed her hand over her stomach and flashed that flawless smile. "We're going to have a baby," she said, like she was announcing the weather. Ethan's reaction was instant and explosive. He lit up with joy, beaming like a man who had just been given a second chance at happiness. He picked Michelle up and spun her around the kitchen, both of them laughing like this was some romantic movie montage. I sat there, my spoon suspended halfway to my mouth, feeling like I had been pushed to the outer edges of the universe. That night, Ethan said something I'll never forget. His hand was resting protectively on Michelle's stomach when he looked at me and said, "This is our second chance, our chance to do it right." He didn't have to explain what he meant. The message was loud and clear. I had been the trial run, a placeholder. This baby was the real thing, the child they could truly call their own. That was the moment I stopped trying. I started spending as much time away from the house as possible. Long hours in the library, part-time shifts at a small bookstore downtown, after-school clubs and volunteer work. I told myself I was busy, driven, focused. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want to go home. Michelle's pregnancy progressed, and on a Tuesday in March, she gave birth to a baby boy, Marcus. He was healthy, with a full head of dark hair and wide, curious eyes. Ethan cried in the delivery room, not quiet tears. I watched it all from the doorway, forgotten, invisible. I wondered if he'd ever held me like that when I was small, if he'd ever looked at me with that kind of love in his eyes. In those first weeks after Marcus was born, I noticed something off. Jason, Ethan's younger brother, was always around. At first, I thought he was just being supportive, but then he started showing up more than seemed normal. He brought flowers for Michelle, designer baby clothes, expensive toys. He always found reasons to hold Marcus when Ethan wasn't around. He seemed unusually invested. I started paying closer attention. Jason ran a successful tech company, lived alone, and had no kids of his own. Michelle mentioned him often, always with an affectionate smile. Too affectionate, maybe. There were too many coincidences. The late-night phone calls Michelle would abruptly end when someone entered the room. The shopping bags from boutiques Jason had once mentioned. The way she lit up when he came over and then tried to hide. 3 months after Marcus was born, I was supposed to be asleep. It was past midnight when I heard Michelle's voice in the kitchen. She was on the phone, whispering. I crept down the hallway, careful to avoid the creaky step, and pressed myself against the wall near the door. "I told Jason not to send any more gifts here," she said. "Ethan's getting suspicious about how much attention you're giving the baby." My blood froze. "I know you want to be involved," she continued, "but we have to be careful, at least until Marcus is older. Then maybe we can figure out how to tell him the truth about his real father." I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront them both immediately. Part of me wanted to tell Ethan the moment he walked through the door. But another part of me, the part that had learned to be cautious in a house where affection was conditional, knew I needed proof. And deep down, I knew I was going to find it. Another part of me, the cautious, methodical side that had quietly observed this family for years, chose patience over impulse. That side had been cataloging every slight, every inconsistency, every tiny fracture in the glossy veneer of Ethan and Michelle's perfect marriage. And now, it told me to wait, to keep collecting evidence. To build a mountain of truth so undeniable, so complete that when the time came, no one could refute it. Because somewhere deep in the corners of my mind, a plan was forming, a strategy for the day Ethan would finally discard me for good. I knew it would come. It was inevitable, and when it did, I'd be ready. Graduation day turned out to be that day. That late-night phone call I had overheard in the kitchen. It shattered the illusion and changed everything. I wasn't just a grieving girl trying to survive in the cold orbit of a distant stepmother anymore. I became something else entirely. An investigator hiding in plain sight, living in the shadows of my own house, gathering clues. And the surprising part, Michelle made it easy. For someone orchestrating a long-term affair, she was surprisingly sloppy. Or maybe she thought I didn't matter. Maybe she assumed the quiet stepdaughter was just background noise, too sad, too harmless to notice anything. But I noticed. I noticed everything. Take her Tuesdays, for instance. Every week at breakfast, she'd announce her manicure appointment at the upscale salon downtown. She made a whole performance of it, as if anyone cared. She always left the house at exactly 10 a.m., perfectly put together like she was going to a photo shoot, and returned around 2, hands gleaming with fresh polish, arms weighed down with shopping bags. But something didn't add up. It took 20 minutes to drive downtown, maybe an hour for a manicure 20 minutes back. Even with shopping, there was too much time unaccounted for. 3 hours that didn't fit the timeline. So, one Tuesday, I skipped school, faked a sore throat, waited until she left. Then I got into my beat-up Honda and followed her. She didn't go anywhere near the salon. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of the Marriott Hotel on 5th Street. I parked across the street, heart pounding in my chest, and watched as she strutted confidently into the lobby like she owned the place. There wasn't a moment of hesitation. This wasn't a one-time thing. 20 minutes later, Jason's sleek silver BMW rolled into the same lot. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Suspecting something is one thing. Seeing it unfold with your own eyes is another. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was betrayal, to Ethan, to our family, and worst of all, to Caitlin's memory. I drove home before Michelle returned, rehearsed my story, and acted the part. When she walked in carrying her boutique bags and showing off coral pink nails, I smiled and asked about her appointment. "Wonderful as always," she said breezily, flashing her polished fingers. "And I found the cutest outfit for Marcus at that little children's store on Main." She lied so easily, so effortlessly, her voice smoothed, her eyes sparkling, her demeanor utterly convincing to anyone who didn't know better. But I did. And that day marked the beginning of a deeper investigation. Michelle's phone became my next target. She was glued to it constantly, texting, checking social media, browsing online stores. But the moment Ethan entered the room, she'd flip it face down or stuff it into her purse with suspicious urgency. Innocent people don't hide their phones like that. One evening, she left it unattended on the kitchen counter. She had gone upstairs to check on Marcus. I had seconds, maybe less, just enough to see her recent messages. Jason's name was at the top. The preview showed, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, same place, same..." The screen locked. I memorized the time and date. It was more than enough to prove a pattern. Then there were the gifts. Michelle's taste in jewelry had suddenly escalated. Diamond earrings, designer watches, a gold bracelet she claimed Ethan had surprised her with after a doctor's appointment. But I recognized that bracelet. Jason had given it to Caitlin for her birthday 3 years earlier. She'd worn it constantly, until the cancer took away her strength and her interest in accessories. After the funeral, it disappeared. Now, it was wrapped around Michelle's wrist like a trophy. It wasn't just an affair. It was a desecration. The phone calls got bolder, too. Whispered conversations in the kitchen late at night when she thought everyone was asleep. I would lie in bed, eyes wide open, straining to catch snippets of dialogue. One night, I crept downstairs barefoot and leaned against the wall near the door. "I told you, Ethan doesn't suspect anything," Michelle was whispering. "We just have to be patient until Marcus is older. No, it's hard, but we can't risk it right now." My chest tightened. The words blurred into each other, hushed and cautious. But the message was clear. She was planning a future with Jason, and Ethan had no idea. Still, I kept waiting, watching, collecting. The final confirmation didn't come from texts or gifts or whispered calls. It came from Marcus. Because babies don't lie, they don't scheme, they don't know how to hide the truth written in their genes. As Marcus grew, his features became more defined, and it was undeniable he looked nothing like Ethan. Ethan had clear blue eyes and smooth brown hair. Marcus's eyes were almost black, and his hair curled thickly at the edges. His fingers were long and narrow like Jason's. His smile was uneven in the exact same way. Even his laugh, a musical high-pitched giggle, was Jason's, right down to the rhythm. But the real slip happened one lazy afternoon when Michelle was bouncing Marcus on her lap. "Come on, little Jay," she cooed, laughing. Not Marcus. Little Jay. Slip of the tongue? Maybe. But in that moment, everything clicked. All the pieces aligned. Jason wasn't just Marcus's uncle. He was his father. And Michelle had just confirmed it out loud. The moment Michelle's lips formed the words "Little Jay," something in the air shifted. She caught herself instantly, eyes darting around the room like a thief who'd accidentally tripped an alarm. I was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to do my homework, but in reality, I had heard every syllable. Our eyes locked for the briefest of seconds. I saw something flicker in her expression, Hispanic, or maybe a frantic recalculation. "I meant to say little guy," she said too quickly, the forced cheerfulness in her voice sounding like brittle glass. "Just a slip, that's all." Sure it was. That night, lying in bed with my mind racing, I made my decision. The whispers, the gifts, the late-night calls, they were suspicious, but still circumstantial. If I wanted to expose the truth, really, undeniably prove it, I needed evidence no one could refute. Something Ethan wouldn't be able to excuse or dismiss. I needed science. Collecting DNA samples turned out to be surprisingly easy. Jason came over for Sunday dinner, just like he always did. While he was busy entertaining Marcus in the living room, I slipped into the bathroom he'd used and plucked a few strands of hair from the sink. Ethan's sample was even easier. His hairbrush in the master bathroom gave me exactly what I needed, unnoticed, while Michelle was busy in the laundry room. Marcus's DNA was trickier. I couldn't exactly swab his cheek without drawing attention. But babies are messy by nature, and Michelle often left pacifiers scattered around the house. One afternoon, she walked away from one that Marcus had dropped on the coffee table. I waited until she was in the other room, then slid it into a Ziploc bag and tucked it into my backpack. Finding a lab willing to run the tests for a 17-year-old was the hardest part. Most of the reputable places required paperwork, parental consent, legal documentation. But I found a small independent clinic on the edge of town. I paid in cash, told the technician it was part of a high school science project. She barely looked at me, just nodded and took the samples. "Standard paternity test," she said. 2 to 3 weeks for results. We'll call you. The waiting nearly broke me. Every day, I had to sit through Michelle's performance as the perfect wife and mother. I had to watch Ethan gaze adoringly at Marcus, oblivious to the storm brewing under his roof. Jason continued to show up, always smiling, always helpful, always just a little too interested in Michelle's every move. Each time he picked up Marcus, each time Michelle laughed just a little too hard at his jokes, my stomach churned. Every day, I wondered what I'd do when I got the results. Would I confront Michelle, tell Ethan privately, or keep the truth hidden until it served a purpose? I didn't know, but I knew I had to be ready. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was working the register at the bookstore when my phone rang. "Miss Richardson, this is Linda from Accuracy Labs. Your test results are ready for pickup." I almost dropped the phone. This was it, the point of no return. I drove to the lab after my shift, hands clammy, heart racing. Linda handed me a plain white envelope, my name printed neatly across the front. "Everything you need is in there," she said. "The results are conclusive." I sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at it. I could have opened it then, ripped the seal and confirmed what I already knew in my gut, but I didn't. I drove home and slid the envelope between the pages of an old worn copy of Jane Eyre, Caitlin's favorite book, the one she used to read to me when I was little. Hiding a truth so explosive inside a story about another orphaned girl seemed fitting. I didn't open it that night. Or the next. I kept telling myself I needed to wait. For what, I wasn't sure, but some instinct told me there would come a moment when the truth would need to be weaponized, when Ethan would finally push me to the edge, and I would be ready to push back. That moment came sooner than I thought. Graduation morning. I was upstairs in my room, zipping up my dress, when I heard raised voices through the floor vents. Michelle's voice was sharp, brittle. "You can't seriously be doing this today, Ethan." "She's not our responsibility anymore," he replied coldly. "She's not our daughter, not really." The words felt like a slap. "She's your daughter," Michelle argued. "You adopted her." "Adapted," he repeated with deliberate emphasis. "And it's time she learned to stand on her own. I've supported her long enough. This ends today." I crept to the top of the stairs, heart pounding, listening to the conversation unravel like a carefully staged betrayal. "But cutting off her college fund now," Michelle hissed, "at her graduation." "It's the perfect time," Ethan said. "Final, public, no negotiations." Downstairs, Marcus was wailing in his high chair, upset by the tension. Upstairs, my blood turned cold. This wasn't a moment of frustration. This had been planned, calculated. He wanted to hurt me, to strip away my security, my future, and my dignity in one surgical strike, to cut me off in front of everyone and watch me flounder. But I was ready. I pulled the envelope from my copy of Jane Eyre and tucked it into the folder with my speech notes, the speech I knew I'd never get to read. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply chose my best outfit and got dressed with the quiet resolve of someone preparing for battle. In the car, Michelle sat stiffly in the passenger seat. She kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, her usual small talk absent, replaced by anxious silence. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw set like stone. And Marcus, the only innocent one among us, gurgled happily in his car seat, unaware of the storm he was born into. As we pulled into the school lot, the gymnasium looming ahead, I placed my hand over the folder in my lap. I wasn't just going to walk across the stage today. I was going to burn it to the ground. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement, a sea of families filling the bleachers with balloons, banners, and proud smiles. The Hendersons had brought metallic balloons that bobbed with every movement. The Patels held up a large, handmade sign with glittery letters that read, "Congratulations, Priya." These were normal families, celebrating milestones, capturing memories. Their joy was loud, contagious, beautiful. Ethan, of course, had positioned himself like a strategist. He chose the fourth row, visible, but just far enough from the stage to make a swift exit if things went sideways. He sat with his arms crossed, his phone clutched tightly in one hand, checking it often. Michelle sat beside him, bouncing Marcus on her lap like a prop she didn't quite know how to manage. Her smile was as brittle as glass, constantly shifting as she adjusted her oversized sunglasses. I joined the other graduates, finding my place in the lineup. My heart pounded, but not from stage fright. I wasn't nervous in the traditional sense. I was electrified. Anticipation coursed through me. This was the day. The culmination of years of quiet survival, of waiting for the right moment. Around me, my classmates whispered about their plans. Jessica Chin was off to Stanford. Mike Rodriguez had landed an internship at Goldman Sachs. Their parents had spent years helping them prepare for the future. Every name called felt like a small victory, each cheer like an echo of dreams being realized. I could feel their joy, sincere and radiant, and I was happy for them, really. They had the kind of support I had only ever fantasized about. The ceremony began, just as ceremonies always do. The principal welcomed everyone, her voice amplified and bright. The valedictorian, some nervous but sweet overachiever, gave a speech about beginnings, opportunities, and how this wasn't the end but merely a new chapter. I heard almost none of it. My attention was on Ethan, every micro-mixendavy twitch of his jaw, every time he adjusted his tie. I was watching for signs, but the truth was, I already knew what was coming. When the names started, the room transformed. Each student stepped up, posed, smiled, and returned to thunderous applause. Parents stood to clap, to wave, to immortalize the moment with their phones. Even the faculty looked proud. It was exactly what graduation should be. And the ours. David Ramirez got a standing ovation from his massive family, 8 people in matching t-shirts who had driven from Chicago. Rebecca Reynolds' grandmother whistled loud enough to make the gym echo. Zoe Richardson. I rose slowly, smoothing down the front of my gown. The gym fell into that respectful silence reserved for each graduate's walk to the stage. This was meant to be my moment, my rite of passage, my first step into adulthood. Instead, it turned into something else entirely. Ethan stood. Not to applaud, not to cheer. He stood the way someone rises to address a courtroom, his voice cut clean through the auditorium. "You're not my real daughter anyway." The shock was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones stopped recording and then started again. New videos from new angles. Even the principal froze, mid-handshake with the student next in line. "I'm cutting you off," Ethan continued, as if this were a business meeting. "No college fund, no family support, nothing. You're 18. Time you learned what the real world is like." Gasps rolled through the crowd like thunder. Some parents turned their children away. Others leaned in, stunned. On stage, my classmates stood frozen, their smiles wiped clean. Michelle tugged at Ethan's sleeve, her voice a panicked whisper. "Ethan, please, not like this, not here." But he shook her off. "She's not entitled to anything from this family. I've fulfilled my obligation. I gave her a home, an education, a chance. But she's not my blood, and she never will be." The silence was profound. Even Marcus stopped babbling. 400 people watched as my life was dismantled in public. But I didn't cry. I didn't break. Because this wasn't Ethan's victory. This was mine. Clarity snapped into place like puzzle pieces falling together. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The stage was set, the audience was here, and I had a story to tell. I didn't walk to the diploma table. I turned and made my way to the podium. The principal moved to intercept me, but I raised one hand. "I need to say something," I said. My voice was clear, calm, certain. The auditorium stilled. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. "Since we're sharing family secrets," I began, gripping the podium, "I think it's only fair that we tell the whole truth." I pulled the envelope from my graduation folder, the one that had been nestled inside Jane Eyre for weeks, the one I had been saving. "You're right, Ethan," I said, looking directly at him and deliberately using his first name. "I'm not your biological daughter. Caitlin, my real mother, told me that herself when I was old enough to understand, and she made sure I knew I was wanted, that I was chosen, that I was loved. Ethan's expression cracked, the confidence drained from his face. But here's something you don't know about DNA, I said, opening the envelope slowly, methodically. It doesn't just tell you where you come from. Sometimes it reveals what people are trying to hide. I held up the test results. Your son, the baby you've been so proud to parade around these past 6 months, he's not yours? The gasp that followed was seismic. Michelle, I continued, has been having an affair with your brother, Jason, for over a year. The murmurs turned to full-blown chaos. People stood, turned, gasped. Phones captured every moment. Michelle's face went gray. Ethan's legs gave out beneath him, and he slumped into his seat. And that child she's holding, I said, not bothering to hide the steel in my voice. That's your nephew, Ethan, not your son. Michelle choked, literally choked, and bolted from her seat. She still had Marcus in her arms as she stumbled down the aisle, her designer heels clicking frantically against the gym floor. She didn't look back. But I did. I looked back at Ethan, and for once he had nothing to say. Heels clacking against the polished floor, Michelle bolted for the exit like a woman fleeing the scene of a crime. She held Marcus tightly, her designer heels catching on chair legs as she stumbled down the aisle, pushing past stunned guests. The gymnasium doors slammed behind her with a reverberating bang that echoed in the silence she left behind. I raised the official papers high, the printed seal glinting slightly under the gymnasium lights. I have the DNA test results right here, I said into the microphone. My voice didn't tremble, it was calm, cold. There's a 99.9% probability that Michelle's child shares your DNA, but not in the way you think. The auditorium erupted into chaos, gasps, whispers, a wave of disbelief. People leapt from their seats, stood on tiptoe, craning their necks for a better view. My classmates on the stage turned, mouths open, completely forgetting their own impending diplomas. Jason, I said clearly, is the biological father. That name landed like a grenade. The crowd exploded with reaction, some people gasping, others whispering furiously. Phones were up again, catching every angle. Everyone wanted a piece of the drama, a snippet for TikTok, a live stream for Facebook. But I wasn't done. I turned my gaze toward the doors where Michelle had vanished. Oh, and Michelle, I called out, knowing she could still hear me even through the thick gym walls. You might want to be more careful about where you leave your hotel receipts, and your jewelry receipts, and all those lunch receipts from your little romantic dates with Jason. I didn't need to hear her response. The crowd heard me, that was enough. When I turned back to Ethan, he was a different man. Gone was the composed businessman who had stood so confidently just moments before. His face looked hollow, his hands limp in his lap. He stared at me like I was someone he'd never met. And, in a way, I was. You wanted to cut me off, I said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to make sure everyone knew I wasn't really part of your family. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage and looked down at him. Well, congratulations, I said. You just gave me the perfect opportunity to return the favor. Without waiting for a reaction, I walked off the stage, not toward the diploma table, but straight out of the gymnasium. The crowd buzzed behind me, an electric hum of disbelief, curiosity, and admiration. The parking lot was shockingly quiet, as though the chaos inside couldn't seep through the walls. I slipped into my Honda and sat for a moment, my hands trembling as the adrenaline drained from my body. My phone started buzzing immediately. Text messages, missed calls, notifications from classmates, acquaintances, people I barely knew. Some were stunned, some were supportive, some just wanted more details. I turned the phone off. By the time I got home to my apartment, the video was already online. Someone had live-streamed the entire confrontation, and it was spreading like wildfire. Within hours, the clip had tens of thousands of views. Headlines were already appearing on local news sites. Graduation shocker, student expose affair and paternity scandal during ceremony. High school senior drops DNA bombshell at commencement. I sat on my bed and watched it play out on my laptop. I saw myself on screen, calm, measured, almost surgical in my delivery. It barely felt like me. The girl on the screen wasn't shaking, she wasn't scared, she was in control. The attention grew quickly. By the next day, regional news outlets were running segments. By midweek, national tabloids were emailing requests for interviews. Producers from talk shows were calling the bookstore where I worked. They wanted exclusives. They wanted my story. I ignored them all. But while I could avoid the media frenzy, I couldn't ignore the fallout it had caused. Michelle disappeared. Literally. That same night, neighbors saw her loading suitcases into her car. Marcus was strapped into his car seat, unaware of the chaos. By morning, she was gone. Her social media accounts were deleted, the curated images of a perfect family life scrubbed clean like it had never existed. Jason, unsurprisingly, tried to spin the story. He released a statement through his lawyer, calling the DNA results fabricated and an elaborate hoax engineered by a disturbed teenager. He claimed I had a vendetta, a thirst for attention. But the evidence was solid, and it was everywhere. His business partners started asking questions. Investors pulled out of deals. His clean-cut bachelor image started to fray under the weight of scrutiny. Ethan's response was the most dramatic. Within 48 hours of graduation, he filed for divorce. He hired a private investigator who unearthed everything: receipts for hotel stays dating back over a year, credit card charges for expensive dinners, even airline tickets for weekends away that Ethan hadn't known about. The truth wasn't just confirmed, it was documented. And that truth shattered Ethan. Neighbors told reporters they saw him wandering his backyard at 3:00 a.m. mumbling to himself. His colleagues at work whispered about his erratic behavior, missed meetings, decisions that didn't make sense. He was unraveling. And I didn't feel satisfied. I felt hollow. I had set this plan in motion, executed it perfectly, but the justice I had longed for, the vindication I had dreamed about, didn't feel like victory. It felt like ash. 1 week later, I came home from a late shift at the bookstore and found him sitting on the steps outside my apartment. Ethan looked destroyed. His once perfect hair was unkempt, his tailored suit was wrinkled, his eyes were red and tired. "Zoe," he said, standing up as I approached. His voice cracked. "Can we talk?" I almost said no, almost walked past him into my building without a word. But there was something in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his hands trembled slightly. 5 minutes, I said. We sat on the old wooden bench in the courtyard behind my building. A jogger passed by with headphones in, oblivious to the small reckoning taking place in the fading twilight. For a long while we didn't speak. Finally Ethan exhaled. "You were right to expose it," he said, voice hoarse. I wish I had protected you sooner. I wish I had been the father you deserved instead of the coward I was." I had imagined this moment, 100 versions of it. I pictured myself cold, detached, maybe even smug. But as I sat beside this broken man who had once raised me, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. He took a breath, his eyes glassy with something deeper than sadness. "I see guilt now," he murmured. "Not just regret, not shame. Real guilt, the kind that sits heavy in your bones. For how I treated you, for how I let Michelle treat you, for how I stood by and watched Jason twist everything without lifting a finger." From his jacket he pulled out an envelope, smaller and more delicate than the one I had brought to graduation, its paper yellowed at the corners with time. "Caitlin left this for you," he said, holding it out like it might burn him. "I was supposed to give it to you on your 18th birthday, but I couldn't. I was too afraid of what it might say about me." My fingers trembled as I accepted the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, soft, looping, written in her careful, elegant script. "For my darling Zoe, when she's old enough to understand." "She knew," Ethan added quietly. "About Michelle, about Jason. Caitlin figured it out months before she passed. But she never said a word. She just wanted to protect you." I held the envelope close for a moment before gently opening it, fearing the pages inside might crumble like ashes. But they were intact. 2 full pages filled with her familiar handwriting, wobbly in parts, the ink trailing slightly. The words were nonetheless clear. "My dearest Zoe," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And Ethan has finally found the courage to give you what I couldn't say out loud. I hope that also means you're old enough to understand what I'm about to tell you." I swallowed hard, the words drawing tears before I reached the second paragraph. "I know about Michelle and Jason. I've known for a long time. I've seen the way they steal glances, the guilty way they avoid being alone when anyone might notice. I could have exposed them. I could have confronted Ethan, but I didn't. Not because I was afraid for me, but because I didn't want you to grow up in a house filled with bitterness and betrayal. You deserve more than that. You deserve peace." Tears blurred my vision, but I kept reading. "You are my daughter in every way that matters. Biology is science. Love is what makes a family. I chose you. When Ethan hesitated about adoption, I fought for you. Because the moment I saw your photo, I knew you were meant to be mine. Ours. Ethan struggles with love, always has. He lost his parents so young, and he built walls so high, so thick, that nothing could reach him. Not grief, not love, not joy. Those walls kept him safe, but they kept us out too. Be patient with him. If anyone can help him tear those walls down, it's you. You have the strength I never did, the fire I never dared to fan. I pressed the pages to my heart as I reached the last few lines. I may not be there to see you graduate, to help you plan your wedding or hold your children in my arms, but I am with you in every decision you make, in every act of kindness, in every time you choose courage over silence. You are wanted, you are loved, you are enough. Always. Forever your mother, Caitlin. By the time I finished, my face was wet with tears. Next to me, Ethan was silently crying too, his hand covering his mouth like the sound might break him further. I failed her, he whispered, raw and hoarse. I failed both of you. She saw what I couldn't, and she protected you the way I never did. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my chest like armor. She loved us, I said quietly. Even after everything, she still loved us. After a moment of silence, Ethan spoke again, clearing his throat. I looked at him, really looked for the first time. I saw past the polished shell and into the hollowed-out man underneath. He wasn't proud or powerful anymore. He was a man undone. I don't want your money, Ethan, I said. His face crumpled. Then, what do you want? Tell me, how do I fix this? I stood up slowly, Caitlin's letter still held close. I want you to mean it when you apologize. I want you to stop feeling sorry for yourself and actually try to be better. He nodded, silent. And I want you to stop saying my name like I'm a stranger. I want you to say it like you used to, like I'm family, like I'm your daughter. For a moment he couldn't speak. He swallowed hard. When he did find his voice, it cracked with emotion. Can you forgive me, daughter? The word lingered between us, heavy and healing, like a bridge forming over all the years of silence and distance and pain. I thought about holding on to my anger. I thought about Caitlin's words, about choosing love over fear. I thought about who I wanted to be. Yes, I said, I forgive you. Not because it was easy, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to be free from the weight I had carried for so long. Forgiveness wasn't a gift for him, it was a choice for me. As I turned to head back into my building, I heard his voice behind me, quiet, but filled with hope. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for giving me a chance to be better. I didn't turn around, but I smiled, for the first time in what felt like years. The air felt different when I entered my apartment. Not colder, not warmer, just lighter, as though something heavy had been lifted off my shoulders without me even realizing I'd been carrying it. That night, I stood by the window, looking out over the soft glow of city lights. The future no longer looked like a long corridor of fear and rejection. It looked open, bright, possible. The lies were finally gone. And for the first time in my life, the truth had set me free. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Free to make choices based on my own dreams, not the approval of someone else. Free to carve out an identity beyond titles like adopted daughter, replacement child, or burden fulfilled. I was just Zoe whole, self-defined, no longer tethered to the need for validation from a man who only now realized the value of what he'd almost discarded. The decision to leave Ethan's house came with surprising clarity. After everything, he had tried to make amends. He offered for me to stay, suggested we could start fresh together under the same roof. But I knew better. Healing required space. Growth demanded independence. I needed to know, truly know, that I could shape a future without leaning on what was broken. Packing took only a few hours. 18 years of living fit neatly into 6 cardboard boxes and 2 wheeled suitcases. Most of it was books, novels Caitlin had gifted me, well-worn school textbooks, and the journals I'd filled during years when I felt invisible. The rest was just clothes and a handful of cherished photographs, mostly of Caitlin and me, our heads tilted together, laughter frozen in time. While emptying my desk drawers, I stumbled upon a small wooden box I hadn't thought about in years. Caitlin had given it to me for my 13th birthday, carved with a swirling design and a tiny brass latch. Inside were relics of my early childhood. My first library card, a dried daisy from my backyard, a note Caitlin had written when I lost my first tooth and was terrified of the tooth fairy. Tucked at the bottom was a folded paper I'd never noticed before. The heading read in Caitlin's familiar loopy handwriting, "Why We Chose Zoe." The ink had faded slightly, but every word felt like sunlight on a cold day. She has curious eyes, always watching, always learning. Her smile lights up the whole room. She's gentle with the neighbor's cat. She organizes her toys by color without being asked. She said thank you to the social worker 3 times. She reminds me of myself at that age, quiet but fierce. She needs us as much as we need her. And below, in darker ink, Ethan finally held her tonight, really held her. I think he's falling in love too. I sat on the edge of my stripped bed, the piece of paper trembling in my hands, tears streaming freely. She had chosen me, fought for me before I even knew what it meant to be fought for. She had seen value in a shy little 2-year-old and decided to build her world around nurturing it. Moving into my new apartment, a tiny but sun-drenched studio near campus, felt less like escaping and more like stepping into my rightful place in the world. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the paint was chipped in places, but it was mine. I filled it with memories that mattered, floating shelves lined with books, framed pictures of Caitlin and me Meatla, small mementos of love, not wealth. The morning after I moved in, I unpacked the final box. At the bottom were Caitlin's journals, leather-bound, faded at the edges. I had saved them after she passed, but grief had always kept me from opening them. Until now. I sat cross-legged on my new floor, sunlight spilling across the hardwood, and opened the first journal. March 15th. Met with the adoption agency today. They showed us profiles of available children. One little girl with 2 years old, dark hair, serious eyes, caught my attention. I can't explain it, but something in her photo spoke to me. Ethan wants to consider the infants, but I can't stop thinking about her. She's been in 3 foster homes already. She needs someone who chooses her and means it. March 22nd. Ethan's warming to the idea. I think he's afraid that bonding with an older child won't be natural. I told him love isn't forced, it's built choice by choice, day by day. April 3rd. We're approved. First visit is next week. I can't sleep. I keep imagining her laugh, her footsteps in our hallway. I bought her a stuffed elephant today, something soft to hold when everything else feels unfamiliar. Every entry pulled me deeper into the narrative of how I came to be theirs. She chronicled my first giggle in their living room, the fever that kept me up all night, and how I finally allowed her to hold me for comfort. The morning I whispered mama for the first time. June 12th. Zoe's been with us 2 months now. She's learning to trust. Tonight, when I was crying about my sister's cancer, she brought me her favorite blanket and tucked it into my lap. Such a tender soul in such a small frame. Saying 1. First day of preschool. She was nervous but brave, clutched my hand the whole way, then squared her shoulders and walked in like she owned the place. Ethan says she gets that determination from me. I hope so. It was like reading a love letter to my own childhood. Each fear, each triumph, each ordinary moment was painted with care, documented not just to remember. Even the entries about Ethan revealed truths I hadn't understood as a child. His hesitations, his awkwardness. They weren't coldness. They were fear. Fear of getting close. Fear of failing. November 20th. Ethan read Zoe 3 bedtime stories tonight. She fell asleep with her tiny hand wrapped around his finger. Later, I found him crying in the hallway. I didn't know I could love someone this much, he said. What if I ruin it? I told him. The very fact that he worries means he won't. Reading that, something inside me softened. The distance I'd always felt from him hadn't been cruelty. It had been self-doubt wrapped in the armor of professionalism and detachment. And while that didn't excuse his choices, it explained them. And sometimes, understanding is enough to start healing. I closed the journal gently and placed it beside me, then looked around my apartment. A small, imperfect place filled with light and truth. No secrets, no lies, no ghost of obligation. Just Zoe. Independent, forged by truth, and finally, completely free. His distance hadn't come from indifference. It had been fear all along. A deep, paralyzing fear of loving too much, of losing what he loved, of not being enough as a father. Caitlin had seen that in him. She'd understood the vulnerable parts of Ethan I had only begun to comprehend. 1 week after settling into my new place, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was the Family Support Center downtown. The director, a warm-voiced woman named Maria, said they'd seen the viral video of my graduation and had a question. We were moved by how you stood your ground, she told me during our first meeting, her hands folded across a notepad filled with statistics and case files. We need voices like yours, young people who know what it's like to grow up in the system. Kids who can speak from lived experience about the pain, the resilience, and the possibilities. That week, I started volunteering. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I joined small groups of children in a brightly lit rec room decorated with hand-drawn posters and paper hearts. Some kids were awaiting placement, others had just been adopted. All of them were in that liminal space of searching, trying to understand where they fit in a world that hadn't always been kind to them. There was Emma, 8 years old, with haunted eyes and a laugh that came out in short bursts, like it was afraid to stay too long. She'd been in 4 homes over 2 years and had quietly convinced herself that no one ever stayed. There was David, 14, a wall of defiance in sneakers and headphones. He made it his mission to keep everyone at arm's length before they could hurt him first. And Sarah, 10 years old, perfectly behaved and heartbreakingly hopeful. She thought if she was just good enough, polite enough, perfect enough, someone would finally decide she was worth keeping. I didn't lecture them. I didn't tell them how to feel. I listened. I played board games and helped with homework. And when they were ready, I shared pieces of my story, not the viral spectacle, but the quiet truths beneath it. One evening, as we worked on collage projects in the art room, Emma looked up from her pile of cutout magazine clippings, glitter sticking to her tiny fingers. "Do you hate your dad?" she asked, her voice too calm for her age. I glanced at her, scissors in hand, then gently set them down. "No," I said. "I used to think I did, but really, I was just hurting, and anger, it feels easier than hurt sometimes." "But he was mean to you," she said, narrowing her eyes. "At your graduation, I saw the video." I took a breath. He was scared. Adults do cruel things when they're scared, just like kids sometimes do. That doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean you have to let them keep hurting you. But it means they're human, messy, flawed, afraid. "So what do you do?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "You decide who you want to be, not in reaction to what they did, but in defiance of it. You choose kindness when others choose cruelty. You build a family out of people who love you for who you are, not who they want you to be." Emma smiled then, not her usual wary half-smile, but a real one. She reached over and held my hand, sticky with glue and confetti. "Can I be in your family?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt something in my chest crack open and knit itself together again. "You already are," I whispered back. "All of you in this room. You're part of my family now." 3 months after graduation, Ethan showed up at the center during one of my shifts. I found him in the lobby, standing awkwardly between a mural of handprints and a bulletin board announcing pizza night. He looked like he didn't belong to our bulletin board either. Even though he didn't bother with pizza, Ethan showed up at the center during one of my shifts, 3 months after graduation, and knew it. "I hope it's okay I came," he said, wringing his hands. I wanted to see what you're doing here." I introduced him to Maria, who gave him a polite tour. He watched the kids from a distance, his face unreadable, his eyes lingering on a teenage boy in a hoodie who reminded me of David. "They're strong," Ethan said quietly when I joined him later. "Stronger than they know, like you." We began meeting for dinner after that. Nothing elaborate, just quiet meals, sometimes sandwiches, sometimes Chinese takeout, where we slowly, cautiously, learned to speak to one another without armor. He told me about the accident that killed his parents when he was 16, how that night had taught him that the more you love, the more you can lose, and how, instead of facing that fear, he'd buried it under work, success, and emotional distance. I told him about my college classes, about the center, about how I was learning to be the person I needed when I was younger. "I'm proud of you," he said one evening as we sat in my small apartment, chopsticks in hand, cartons spread across the table. "Not because of what you revealed, not even because of what you've achieved, but because you've chosen to become something strong and kind in spite of everything." Once, those words would have shattered me with joy. Now, they were simply kind to hear. My worth no longer depended on his validation. It lived within me. 6 months after graduation, a package appeared at my door. No return address. Inside was a photo album, hand-bound leather, worn at the edges. I opened it carefully and gasped. Photos I'd never seen filled the pages. Me as a toddler, wrapped in Kaylin's arms. Me planting tulips at age 3, dirt smudging my cheek. Me at 5, in a princess costume, standing between Kaylin and Ethan, beaming like I owned the whole world. On the last page, a note was taped in unfamiliar handwriting. "Your mother kept these in her bedside table. She looked at them every night before she slept. She wanted you to always remember the joy you brought into her life." There was no signature, no name. I never found out who had sent it. But I didn't need to, because someone, maybe a nurse, maybe a friend, had known how deeply I was loved. And they wanted me to know too. That afternoon, standing in my sunlit apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of my new life, I finally understood what freedom truly meant. It wasn't detachment or defiance. It wasn't walking away and never looking back. It was choice. The choice to love, to forgive, to build, to become. I was Zoe Richardson, daughter of Caitlin, and yes, in his flawed way, of Ethan too, a volunteer, a student, a woman who had learned that survival wasn't enough. That thriving shining so brightly you can't be ignored, that was the ultimate victory. 6 months ago, I stood on a graduation stage demanding to be seen. Today, I didn't need to demand anything. Because now, I was the one doing the choosing.